The first warning was not a siren. It was an orange survey stake, almost buried beneath a new terrace. Camden saw a quiet father questioning his family's property and mistook restraint for fear.
2 seconds later, Camden could not move in any useful direction. Devon never threw a punch.
The fight Devon refused was not the danger he had come to stop.
Naomi's old drainage map showed a channel. The new plans had erased it.
Richard chose to wait for certainty. The water did not.
Camden found the warning his father had received and understood why the building around him was sinking.
I need help!
The man he challenged would be the one entering the flood to bring him out.
At 2:13 in the morning, Camden Vale sat wrapped in a silver rescue blanket inside a flood boat. Muddy water covered the street where his father's stone driveway had been. The wall along the lake was gone. 2 lamps remained above the surface. Across from him, Devon Brooks held one hand against his left shoulder. His field jacket was torn at the seam, and whenever the boat struck debris, his jaw tightened. He watched the houses and listened to the rescue radio. Camden had spent most of the night obeying that voice. Hold the line. Breathe before you move. Do not fight the current. Hours earlier, Camden had wanted to prove Devon was afraid of him. Now he stared at the man who had crossed rising water to bring him back. Why? Camden asked. Devon glanced at him. Why what? You knew I went into that building after what I said to you. Camden's wet black belt lay near his shoes. You could have left me there. Naomi Brooks knelt beside her father, checking the sling around his shoulder. She stopped moving. Devon watched a broken fence panel drift past. You were still there, he said. At the rear, a rescue captain called for a medical team. Beyond him, Richard Vale stood on the flooded lawn, holding Sissy, his son's empty raincoat. He looked smaller than he had 6 hours earlier, but the flood had not begun with the rain. It had begun with an orange ribbon no wider than 2 fingers. 11 hours earlier, Naomi found its torn end beneath newly placed limestone blocks. She crouched beside the fence between the Brooks property and the Vale's renovation site while a landscaping crew worked nearby. Dad. Devon was securing 2 outdoor storage bins. The afternoon sky had the flat gray color that made birds disappear before people noticed the weather changing. If this is about moving the rain gauge, he said, I admitted you were right. You admitted it after moving it. Come look. Most of the ribbon had been buried under gravel. Only a dirty strip remained tied to a narrow metal stake. Naomi brushed stones away with her fingertips. Remember the drainage map Aunt Louise kept with the house papers? The map predated half the lakeside homes. Devon's aunt had written one instruction across the bottom. Never close the low ground. Naomi opened a photograph on her phone, taken that morning in the county records room for an environmental engineering project. A faded channel curved from the road, crossed the Vale property, and emptied toward the lake. The orange stake stood directly over that line. Through the fence, Devon saw that Richard's crew had filled the depression with compacted soil. A new retaining wall crossed it, supporting a terrace and young cypress trees. The lowest open path in the neighborhood was now the highest part of Richard's yard. They covered the emergency spillway, Naomi said. Maybe there's a culvert underneath. There isn't. She showed him a photograph of the foundation trench. Solids crossed the entire channel. Why did you take this? The cement truck blocked our driveway. I was documenting a recurring access problem. You were collecting evidence. Those can be the same thing. His phone sounded with a weather alert. 3 inches of rain possible before midnight, with heavier runoff from the hills north of the lake. Devon called the county inspection office. After 2 transfers, an employee said no inspector could arrive until morning. The neighborhood board chair said Richard's permits had been approved and suggested discussing it after the storm. Naomi watched Devon put the phone away. After the storm won't reopen the spillway. No. So what do we do? Devon looked toward the Vale boathouse. Richard stood there with his contractor. Beside him was Camden, home from the martial arts studio, wearing black training pants and a white uniform top beneath an open rain jacket. "We ask them to stop," Devon said, "and if they don't, then everyone downhill learns exactly what was blocked." He opened the gate. Naomi followed before he could tell her to stay behind. Across the property, Camden noticed them coming. He said something to his father, closed his jacket, and stepped away from the boathouse. At that moment, the first drop of rain struck the limestone wall. The rain was still light when Devon and Naomi reached the Vale boathouse. Richard stood beneath its cedar overhang, studying a tablet while his contractor supervised the last load of gravel. "Richard," Devon called, "your retaining wall crosses the old emergency spillway." Richard looked up slowly. "Good afternoon to you too. The county can't send an inspector until morning. Stop the work and uncover the channel until they arrive." Richard handed the tablet to his contractor. The renovation was permitted. The drainage plan was reviewed. Naomi found the original county map. Naomi held out her phone, but Richard barely glanced at it. "I'm sure your school project is thorough," he said. "It is not a civil engineering assessment." "It doesn't need to be," Naomi replied. "The orange survey marker is still in your yard. Your workers buried it." Richard's expression tightened. "You entered my construction area. The trench was visible from our driveway." Camden stepped between them. Rain collected on the shoulders of his black jacket. The white martial arts uniform beneath it made the black belt at his waist impossible to miss. "My father said the permits are valid." Kept his attention on Richard. "A permit doesn't change where water goes." "Then file a complaint," Camden said. "I did." The storm arrives before the inspector. Behind them, the contractor signaled for the small loader to continue. Its bucket pushed another ridge of gravel toward the low ground. Devon raised his voice. "Stop that machine!" The operator looked toward Richard. Richard gave a small downward motion with his hand, ordering him to continue. Camden smiled without humor. "You don't give instructions here." "No," Devon said, "but I can recognize a dangerous decision." Richard stepped closer. "I have invested more in this shoreline than anyone in this neighborhood. I hired licensed professionals. I will not tear apart a finished wall because you found an old ribbon. You don't have to tear it apart. Remove the loose fill and open a temporary passage beside it. And if the rain is ordinary, then you lose a few hours of landscaping. And if I allow every neighbor with a photograph to interfere with my property," Naomi answered before Devon could, "then maybe one of them prevents your property from flooding ours." Camden turned toward her. "Stay out of this." "She brought the evidence," Devon said. "She's already in it." Something in his tone made Camden square his shoulders. He had spent years learning how to read fear before a match. Restless hands, uneven breathing, eyes searching for distance. Devon showed none of those signs. Camden moved closer until less than an arm's length separated them. "You've been looking for a reason to challenge my father since you moved back here. I grew up here, in the smallest house on the lake, and now you act like the whole shoreline belongs to you." Devon glanced toward the loader. "Water doesn't care who owns the largest house." Camden removed his rain jacket and laid it across a railing. Then he tightened the knot of his black belt. Naomi stared at him. "Is that supposed to fix the drainage?" Camden ignored her. "You think I'm some spoiled kid who needs to be taught a lesson," he said to Devon. "Fine. One round in the training room. No cameras, no lawyers. If you win, I'll tell my father to stop the work." Richard's face changed. "Camden, that is not how this will be handled." But Camden kept his eyes on Devon. "And if you win?" Devon asked. You stay off our property and stop questioning my family." Devon looked at him for a long moment. "No." Camden gave a short laugh. "Then stop pretending this is about safety."
You're afraid.
"I'm a father standing beside his daughter. I have nothing to prove by hitting someone else's son." The answer struck Camden harder than an insult would have. He stepped forward and placed a hand against Devon's chest. Devon moved it aside. Camden pushed again, harder. This time, Devon caught his wrist. What followed lasted less than 2 seconds. Devon shifted half a step, turned Camden's arm, and redirected his momentum. Camden found himself facing the boathouse railing with one wrist controlled behind him. Devon had not punched him, thrown him, or forced him to the ground. He had simply removed every useful direction Camden could move. Then he released him. Camden spun around, stunned. His breathing had changed. Devon's had not. Naomi had seen her father handle frightened people during emergency drills. She had seen him carry an injured neighbor down a steep trail. She had never seen him move like that. Neither had Richard. "Where did you learn that?" Camden asked. Devon picked up the rain jacket and handed it back to him. "Where I learned that winning the wrong fight can cost more than losing it." Camden did not take the jacket immediately. Devon turned to Richard. "Open the spillway before the heavy rain reaches the north ridge. If you won't, I'll warn every house below yours and document the condition of this property." Richard's contractor shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Vale, temporary excavation might be worth considering." Richard's gaze moved from his contractor to the wall, then back to Devon. "No changes until the county confirms your claim." Devon nodded once. "Then that is the decision you're making." He walked away with Naomi as the rain began tapping against the boathouse roof. Halfway across the yard, Naomi looked up at him. "You've never told me where you learned that either." Devon kept walking. Right now, the map matters more. Behind them, Camden remained beneath the overhang, holding his jacket. For the first time that afternoon, he was no longer thinking about defeating Devon. He was trying to understand why a man capable of hurting him had chosen, twice, not to do it. By 5:30, Devon's dining table had disappeared beneath maps, property records, flashlights, batteries, and 3 weather radios. Naomi placed her phone beside the oldest document, a yellowed county drainage plan Aunt Louise had kept inside a plastic sleeve for nearly 30 years. The map showed the lake before Richard's Terrace, before the boathouse expansion, and before several homes had been built along the lower road. A dashed blue line crossed the Vale property. Beside it, someone had written, "Emergency overflow, keep clear." Naomi enlarged the photographs she had taken at the county records office. The newer permit shows roof drains and landscaping runoff, but this line is missing. "Missing by mistake?" Devon asked. "Or because the submitted plan begins at the edge of the renovation area?" The old spillway continues underneath it, so leaving out the surrounding land makes it look like nothing was there. Devon studied the documents. "Can you prove the orange stake marked this exact channel?" Naomi opened another image. It showed the survey coordinates beside the faded map. "Within 3 feet," he nodded. "Then we treat it as real." Naomi stared at him. "You already knew it was real." "I knew the ground was wrong. Now we can show why." Devon photographed every page, backed the files up, and sent copies to the county emergency office, the neighborhood board, and every resident living below the Vale property. His message was short: possible obstruction of documented emergency overflow channel. Heavy runoff expected tonight. Move vehicles and essential property away from the lower road. Do not enter moving water. Within 10 minutes, the neighborhood message group erupted. One resident thanked him and asked where to move her car. Another replied that Richard Vale's contractors were licensed. The board chair wrote that residents should avoid spreading unverified alarm. Richard posted only once. "My permits are valid. The property is secure." Devon read it, placed the phone face down, and began loading sandbags into his truck. Naomi followed him outside. The rain had strengthened enough to darken the driveway, but it still looked ordinary. That was the dangerous part. Nothing appeared urgent yet. At the first house downhill, an elderly widow named Mrs. Alvarez opened her garage, while Devon moved boxes from the floor to a workbench. Naomi photographed the electrical panel and marked the safest shutoff route. At the next house, a young couple refused help. Richard said the wall was engineered for a 100-year storm, the husband told them. This isn't only about the wall holding, Naomi replied. It's about where the water goes when it can't follow the old channel. The man looked toward the Vale property, visible above the trees. Are you an engineer? No, I can read a contour map. Devon touched her shoulder. We gave them the warning. Keep moving. They spent the next hour raising outdoor fuel containers, clearing storm grates, relocating 2 vehicles, and marking homes where residents might need help evacuating. Devon turned preparation into a sequence. People first, power second, vehicles uphill. No one crosses water after dark. He spoke calmly enough that anxious neighbors began copying his movements before they fully believed his warning. Naomi noticed it. You've done this before, she said, as they carried a portable pump toward Mrs. Alvarez's porch. I teach emergency preparedness. That isn't what I meant. Devon kept walking. At the boathouse, she continued, Camden pushed you, and you moved like you already knew everything he was going to do. He was angry. Angry people make obvious choices. You controlled a black belt instructor in 2 seconds. He wasn't trying to fight well. He was trying to be seen fighting. That still doesn't answer me. Devon set the pump beneath the porch roof. Tonight is not the time. Naomi laughed once without humor. It's never the time. Rain struck the metal gutter above them. You tell me to document facts, she said. You tell me to speak clearly when adults dismiss me. But the moment a question becomes personal, you disappear. I am standing right here. No, you're organizing me. Devon looked toward her. Naomi's voice lowered. You make a list, you give me a task. You decide what I'm allowed to know, and then you call that protecting me. For a moment, only the pump's test motor filled the space between them. You want to know whether I served, he served, Devon said. I know you served. I want to know why everyone else gets the version of you that can handle anything, while I get told not to ask. His face changed, though only slightly. Naomi saw that she had reached something he kept guarded. Devon unplugged the pump. There are parts of my past that do not become safer because I describe them. I'm not asking for missions or secrets. What are you asking for? To know whether, when things get bad, you're going to trust me or turn me into one more person's waiting behind the line you drew. A weather alert sounded from both their phones. Flash flood warning. Runoff from the northern ridge was arriving faster than predicted. The heaviest rain would reach the lake before 10. Devon read the alert twice. Then he handed Naomi the neighborhood map instead of folding it into his own pocket. Mrs. Alvarez and the Carters may need evacuation, he said. You coordinate them from our house. Keep everyone on the group channel. If I miss a check-in, you call emergency services immediately. Naomi accepted the map, but her expression remained hard. And where will you be? Checking the spillway. You mean checking whether Richard finally listened? Across the lake, thunder rolled behind the hills. They drove back toward the Vale property. Water already ran along both sides of the lower road, carrying leaves and pale gravel toward a storm drain that should have emptied through the old channel. Instead, the water slowed. Then it began to rise. At Richard's yard, works lights illuminated the finished terrace. The loader had been parked. The new limestone wall stood clean and unbroken beneath the rain. Camden was near the boathouse, arguing with the contractor. Richard stood several feet away with his phone pressed to his ear. Devon stopped at the fence. Richard, he called. The warning has been upgraded. Open a temporary channel now. Richard ended the call. The county emergency office said crews are occupied north of us. No one has ordered me to alter the wall. You don't need an order to stop water from entering your neighbors' homes. And you do not have the authority to destroy permitted construction. The contractor stepped closer to Richard. Sir, we can remove the fill beside the eastern section. It will damage the terrace, but it may relieve pressure. Richard looked at the wall, then at the rain washing across his new stonework, not without confirmation. Camden glanced toward Devon. The pride from the boathouse was still there, but now it competed with doubt. Naomi moved to the buried survey stake. Only an inch of orange ribbon remained visible above the runoff. She pointed toward it. The water is following the map. A brown stream crossed the lawn, reached the new wall, and turned. It should have continued downhill toward the lake. Instead, it flowed sideways, toward the first row of homes. Richard watched it happen. Still, he gave no order to reopen the spillway. The rain grew heavier, flattening the grass and swallowing the last visible strip of orange ribbon. The orange ribbon vanished beneath the runoff. Less than 2 minutes later, Naomi's phone filled with messages from the lower road. Water in the Alvarez garage, storm drain overflowing, power flickering at the Carter house. Devon ran downhill while Naomi stayed on the neighborhood channel, directing residents toward the upper intersection. Brown water spread across the pavement in a widening sheet. Sandbags that had seemed excessive an hour earlier were already holding back 6 inches of water. Mrs. Alvarez stood on her porch with a small suitcase against her chest. "My photographs are still inside," she said. "People first," Devon told her. "Everything else waits." Naomi helped her into a neighbor's truck, then called the county dispatcher. A fallen pine had blocked the nearest access road. Fire and rescue crews were coming from the east, but no one could give her an arrival time. Above them, the Vale retaining wall had become a dam. Water pressed against its uphill side and escaped around both ends, cutting new channels through lawns never designed to carry runoff. One stream moved toward the lower homes. The other curled behind Richard's boathouse and struck the lakeside service building. Devon returned to the terrace. "The wall has to be opened." Richard stood beneath an umbrella that had turned inside out. "If we breach it in the wrong place, the terrace could collapse against the house. If you leave it closed, the water will choose another path. I need certainty." The contractor pointed toward the eastern section. "That is where the old spillway should cross. We can pull 3 courses of stone and excavate the fill." "You said should," Richard replied. "The survey files are in the service building. The topographic scan will confirm it." Richard looked across the flooding yard. The small building stood near the boathouse, separated from them by water rushing over the service path. "Then retrieve the files." The contractor stared at him. "That crossing isn't safe anymore." A deep vibration moved through the terrace. Water seeped between 2 limestone blocks, carrying thin lines of soil with it. Devon crouched beside the wall. "The ground underneath is washing out." "We have lake pumps," Richard said. "Activate them." "The pump controls are in that building," the contractor answered. Camden had been standing several feet away, listening. His soaked uniform clung to his shoulders, and the ends of his black belt dripped against his training pants. "What else is inside?" he asked. "The survey tablet, pump controller, laser scanner, job records. Records that show the wall was approved." The contractor hesitated. "Records that show what was built." Camden looked at Devon, then at his father. The doubt in his face lasted only a moment before pride covered it. "I'll get them." "No," Devon said. Camden gave a sharp laugh. "You don't decide that. I'm not challenging you. I'm telling you the path is unstable. My father needs the pump controls. Your father needs you alive." Richard stepped forward. "Camden, wait." But Camden had already removed his rain jacket. He handed it to his father and moved toward the service path. Naomi raised her phone light. The channel is deeper than it looks. Camden tested the first section with 1 foot. Water climbed above his ankle, then his shin. He gripped the boathouse railing and continued sideways. Devon followed along the safer edge. If you lose your footing, turn downstream and float. Do not try to stand. Camden reached the other side. For 1 second, satisfaction crossed his face. Then he pulled open the service building door and disappeared inside. Richard exhaled. He made it. Devon did not answer. He was watching the water strike the building's concrete foundation. Inside, Camden found the pump panel mounted above a workbench. A red fault light blinked beside the main switch. He pressed the reset control, but the motor answered with a low mechanical hum and stopped. The contractor's tablet lay inside a waterproof case on a shelf. Camden opened it. The screen awakened to a chain of sight messages. The most recent was from the contractor to Richard, sent 11 days earlier. Original overflow route appears beneath East Terrace. Recommend revised drainage review before wall installation. Richard's reply was shorter. Proceed under approved plan. We will address field conditions after completion. Camden read both messages twice. Outside, Naomi saw the water change direction. It's cutting underneath him. Devon turned toward the service building. A section of the path dropped several inches. Muddy water poured into the gap, tearing gravel from beneath the concrete slab. Camden grabbed the tablet case and ran to the door. It would not open. The building had shifted just enough to force the frame out of alignment. Camden struck the handle with his palm, then drove his shoulder against the door. It moved less than an inch. "Camden!" Richard shouted. A cracking sound came from beneath the building. The rear corner settled. A metal shelf tipped over inside, blocking the second exit. Camden pulled out his phone, but rain and concrete reduced the signal to a single fading bar. Naomi reached the dispatcher again. "The access road is still blocked," she told Devon. "They're sending a crew on foot, but the water is rising faster than they can reach us." Richard stepped toward the channel. Devon caught his arm. "You'll create a second rescue. That is my son. I know." For the first time that night, Richard stopped arguing. Devon took a flashlight and moved along the edge of the channel, searching for a route that still had solid ground beneath it. Naomi opened the old drainage map on her phone and held it under her rain shell. "The original channel curves behind the building," she said. "If the wall releases all at once, that entire path disappears." A fist struck the service building window from inside. Camden's face appeared behind the wet glass. The confidence he had carried into the boathouse was gone. Devon raised the flashlight. "Camden, can you hear me?" Static broke across Devon's phone. Then Camden's voice came through, thin beneath the rain. "I can't open the door." Another surge pressed against the wall. Stone scraped against stone. Devon looked at the flooded channel, the shifting foundation, and the house lights reflected in water that had never belonged there. Then he heard Camden say the words he had refused to say at the boathouse. "I need help. I need help." Camden's voice reached them through static, stripped of every trace of challenge. Devon pressed the phone closer. "Move away from the door. Find something solid above waist height and stay there. The floor is tilting. Then move slowly. 3 points of contact. Tell me when you are stable." Richard stepped toward Devon. "We have to get him out now." "We will. You're standing here talking while that building sinks." Devon turned to him. "If we rush into that channel without lines, your son gets 3 people trapped beside him instead of 1. Another crack sounded from the service building. One of its windows dipped closer to the water. Naomi watched the neighborhood channel while holding the old drainage map beneath her rain shell. "The lower houses are clear," she said. "Mrs. Alvarez is at the upper intersection. The Carters shut off their power." "Good. Tell everyone to stay uphill." Richard pointed toward the wall. "We should activate the pumps." "The controls are trapped with Camden," the contractor said. "Then bring the portable pump from the garage." "It cannot move this volume of water," Devon replied. "We need ropes, flotation, lights, and people who can follow one set of instructions." Richard looked toward his workers. "Get every rope you can find." "No climbing line," Devon said. "It stretches when wet. Bring the dock rescue rope, life jackets, and the 2 longest extension ladders." The workers hesitated, looking between both men. "Move," Devon said. They moved. A neighbor arrived carrying a marine throw bag. Another brought battery lanterns. Devon placed them along the edge of the flooding terrace, then ordered everyone who was not directly helping to step back from the unstable ground. Richard tried to send 2 workers toward the service path. Devon stopped them. "The outside edge has already collapsed. My son does not have time for caution. Caution is why he still has time." The words landed, but Richard's fear kept searching for something to control. Naomi raised her phone. "Dad, the northern gate just jumped again. Another surge is moving down the ridge. How long? Maybe 12 minutes. Less if the drainage basin is already full." Devon studied the current. The direct path to the building was gone, but part of the old boathouse walkway remained beneath the water. Its support posts formed a darker line in the current. A rescue captain and 2 firefighters appeared through the rain, carrying equipment from the blocked road. Their jackets were streaked with pine sap and mud. The captain took in the wall, the leaning building, and the people gathering near the channel. "Who has site information?" "I do," Devon said. Richard stepped forward. "This is my property. My son is trapped inside. And I need you behind the marked line," the captain replied. Devon gave her the facts in less than 30 seconds. 1 adult trapped, 1 blocked door, rear exit obstructed, foundation undermined. Second surge approaching, possible route along the submerged walkway. The captain looked closely at him. "Brooks?" Devon paused. "Devon Brooks?" "Yes. I saw you teach a water response course 3 years ago." She studied his face again. "You led a SEAL task unit before you retired." Richard turned toward Devon. So did Camden's instructor, the contractor, and every worker close enough to hear. Naomi did not move. The revelation did not explain one hidden moment from her father's past. It explained years of behavior. The numbered emergency bags, the way he checked exits, the calm voice he used when everyone else became louder. Richard stared at him. "You were a SEAL commander? I was responsible for a team," Devon said. "Right now, I'm responsible for getting your son out." Richard faced the captain. "Then give him whatever authority he needs." "His old position does not give him authority here," she said. "His assessment gives us our best plan. If you want to help Camden, follow it exactly." For the first time, Richard nodded without arguing. The captain opened her equipment pack. Together, she and Devon anchored a rescue line to the boathouse foundation. The firefighters secured a second line farther uphill, in case the first anchor failed. Devon put on a flotation vest and clipped into the primary line. Naomi caught his arm. "The building is behind the original spillway." "I know. If the wall opens, the current will go straight through there. That is why we move before the surge arrives." "You said you would trust me. I do. Then don't give me a task just to keep me from stopping you." Devon held her gaze. Rain ran from his forehead into his beard. "I need you on the map," he said. "Not behind a line. Find the surviving marker and track the old channel. If the current changes, you will see it before we do." This time, the responsibility did not feel like a distraction. Naomi nodded. Devon tested the rope, stepped into the water, and felt the current strike his legs. The submerged walkway was narrower than it appeared. Each step had to land beside a support post before the water could pull his foot away. The captain fed him line. 4 minutes, Naomi called. Devon reached the midpoint. A loose section of railing broke free upstream and rushed toward him. He turned his shoulder, let it glance off the flotation vest, and kept moving. Richard stood behind the safety line, with both hands clenched at his sides. The man who had demanded certainty now had none. Devon reached the building and pressed himself against the wall. "Camden!" A fist struck the window from inside. Devon used a rescue hammer to break the corner of the glass, then cleared the frame and climbed through. Water covered the floor. A steel shelf blocked the rear exit, and the room leaned toward the lake. Camden stood on the workbench, holding the waterproof tablet case against his chest. "You came," he said. Devon checked him quickly. No visible injury. Labored breathing. Fear beginning to outrun judgment. "I told you to find something solid. This is solid. It was solid before the foundation moved. Give me the tablet and clip this line to your vest." Camden obeyed. Outside, Naomi found a piece of orange ribbon whipping above the water near the eastern edge of the wall. Then it shifted almost a foot. "Dad!" she shouted into the phone. The marker moved. The ground beneath the wall is failing. A deep grinding sound traveled through the structure. Devon reached the broken window and looked outside. The submerged walkway had disappeared. Between the building and the boathouse, the water had become a single fast-moving channel. The line still connected them to shore, but there was no ground left beneath it. Reaching Camden had been the easy part. Now Devon had to bring them both back through water that had erased their only safe route. The service building shifted again. Camden grabbed the edge of the workbench while water pushed through the broken window. The rescue line stretched from Devon's vest to the boathouse, vibrating under the force of the current. "We can't go back that way," Camden said. "We don't need the walkway," Devon replied. "We need the line." A flash of lightning illuminated the room. Camden looked at the water outside, then at the tilted floor beneath them. "I can't do this." Devon took the waterproof tablet from his hands and secured it inside his vest. "Yes, you can, but not while you're trying to defeat the water." Camden's breathing came fast and shallow. 4 seconds in, Devon said. "Hold for 2. 6 seconds out. I teach breathing control, then use what you teach." Camden closed his eyes and forced air into his lungs. His first attempt broke halfway through. The second lasted longer. Outside, Naomi followed the old spillway line across the drainage map. The orange marker had moved because the soil around it was being pulled toward the wall, but its metal stake remained visible between waves. She pointed her flashlight toward it. "The original channel is east of the building," she told the rescue captain, "but it curves behind the foundation. If you remove the wall directly above the marker, the first release could hit them." The contractor knelt beside her and studied the map. "There was a maintenance cut here," he said, indicating a narrow line several feet west of the marker. It joined the spillway farther downhill. "Can you open it?" Naomi asked. "Only if that section was built the way it appears in the construction record." Richard stepped closer. "Was it?" The contractor did not answer immediately. Inside the building, Devon opened the tablet and found the topographic scan. He enlarged the foundation diagram. "Naomi," he said through the phone, "there's a shallow stone section west of the orange stake, approximately 8 feet." She compared the screen image he described with the old map. "That connects to the maintenance cut," she said. "It would redirect the first release away from the building." Devon looked through the window. "Open the upper 2 courses only. Let the pressure fall gradually. Do not excavate the base until we are across." The captain repeated the order. Firefighters secured themselves to a second anchor while the contractor's workers brought pry bars to the wall. Richard moved to help. The captain stopped him. "Stay behind the line. That wall tall exists because of my decision. And right now, your decision is whether you create another person we have to rescue." Richard stepped back. The workers removed the first limestone block. Water sprayed through the gap. When the second block came free, a narrow stream shot across the terrace and entered the maintenance channel. The water around the service building dropped less than an inch. but its direction changed. "That is our window," Devon said. He clipped Camden's vest to the rescue line. "You go first." Camden looked through the broken window. "What if the building moves? Then you keep moving. What if I lose the line? You're clipped to it. What if, Camden?" Devon waited until the younger man looked at him. "Control what your hands are doing. Let everyone else control the rest." Camden climbed through the window. The current struck his legs and turned him sideways, but he did not fight to stand. He held the rope with both hands and allowed the flotation vest to carry his weight. "Breathe," Devon called. Camden pulled himself forward. On shore, the firefighters hauled the line in short, coordinated movements. Naomi called out the changing current while the captain watched the wall. Camden reached the midpoint. Then the second surge arrived. Water struck the retaining wall with a sound like a heavy door slamming underground. The remaining stones shifted. The primary anchor tore partly loose from the boathouse foundation, and the rescue line dropped toward the debris-filled current. Camden disappeared behind a wave. Devon launched himself through the window and caught the line before it sank beneath a broken railing. His left shoulder struck the concrete frame. Pain ran from his collarbone to his hand. He wrapped the line around an intact walkway support and pulled it upward. "Haul him!" he shouted. The rope tightened across his injured shoulder. Camden surfaced, coughing, still clipped to the line. He remembered Devon's instruction and stopped kicking against the current. He turned onto his back, kept his face above water, and pulled hand over hand. The strain dragged Devon against the support post. His left arm began to lose strength. Naomi saw him slip. "Dad, release it.
Use your second line."
"If I release this one, Camden goes into the foundation." The captain ordered both firefighters onto the haul line. Camden reached the final section. A firefighter entered the shallows, caught his vest, and pulled him behind the boathouse wall. "He's clear," Naomi shouted. Only then did Devon let go. The primary line snapped beneath the surface. His secondary line caught him before the current carried him into the service building. The captain and two neighbors hauled him across the flooded channel. When Devon reached solid ground, Naomi dropped beside him. "You told me to warn you when the current changed." "You did. You didn't tell me you were going to hold a rescue line with your shoulder." "I didn't schedule that part." Despite everything, Naomi laughed once. Then she saw the way he protected his left arm and called for the medic. Richard pushed past the safety line and reached Camden's. He placed both hands on his son's face, as if confirming he was real. Camden stood shaking beneath a rescue blanket. For a few seconds, he held his father. Then he stepped back. "The tablet," he said. Devon removed it from his vest and handed it to him. Richard's expression changed. "Camden, that contains private project records. It contains the warning. This is not the place to discuss that." Camden opened the message chain and carried the tablet to the rescue captain. A county emergency investigator had arrived with the second team and stood beside her. "My father's contractor warned him before the wall was completed," Camden said. "He was told the spillway ran under the terrace." Richard stared at him. "You do not understand the context." Camden's hand trembled, but he did not lower the tablet. "Then explain the context to them." He unlocked the records and gave the device to the investigator. Only hours earlier, Camden had challenged Devon because he believed strength meant forcing another man to yield. Now, soaked and shivering, he made the first disciplined choice of the night. He stopped protecting the decision that had nearly killed him. The emergency investigator accepted the tablet from Camden and placed it inside a waterproof evidence bag. Richard stepped toward him. "Those messages require context." "You'll have an opportunity to provide it," the investigator said. "Right now, we need the construction timeline and every revision connected to this wall. I never intended to endanger anyone." The investigator looked toward the flooded lower road. Intent is not what we're documenting tonight. Behind them, firefighters widened the temporary opening one stone at a time. Water poured through the maintenance cut and followed the route Naomi had identified. The level against the service building began to fall, but the new terrace settled unevenly as supporting soil washed away. The rescue captain ordered everyone off the lower section. Richard watched workers abandon stonework that had taken months to complete. For most of his career, damage had been something he measured in contracts, repair estimates, and insurance limits. Now every scraping block sounded like a decision returning to him. A medic examined Devon's shoulder beneath the boathouse overhang. "You may have damaged the rotator cuff," she said. "You need imaging tonight. I can move my fingers. That is not the medical standard for being fine." Naomi stood beside him with folded arms. "I've been trying to explain that to him for years." Devon looked at her. "Years? You once drove home with a fractured wrist. It was not displaced." The medic tightened the sling. "I'm going to let your daughter win this argument." At 2:13 in the morning, a floodboat carried Devon, Naomi, and Camden toward the temporary medical at the upper intersection. The street beneath them was invisible. Mailboxes, broken fencing, and patio furniture drifted through the beam of the boat's searchlight. Camden sat beneath a silver rescue blanket. His wet black belt lay near his shoes. He looked at Devon's torn jacket and supported shoulder. "Why did you come for me?" Devon watched the flooded houses pass. "You were still there," he said. The answer left Camden with nowhere to hide. Devon had not rescued a friend, an ally, or someone who had earned his loyalty. He had rescued the same man who had pushed him, insulted his home, and mistaken restraint for fear. Camden lowered his eyes. At the medical station, Richard was waiting when the boat arrived. He tried to place a hand on his son's shoulder, but Camden stepped aside. "We should speak privately," Richard said. "About the messages? About what happens next?" "What happens next is that they read them." Richard's voice dropped. "You handed over incomplete project communication during an emergency. People will interpret it in the worst possible way." Camden looked toward the lower road, where emergency lights reflected across the water. "I interpreted it while I was trapped inside the building." "You were frightened, I was informed." Richard's jaw tightened. "Everything I built was meant to protect your future." "No. It was meant to make sure nothing embarrasses you." The words struck something deeper than anger. Camden continued before his courage disappeared. "You taught me that our name had to survive every mistake. I believed you. I protected it until I was standing on a collapsing workbench with proof in my hands." Richard looked at his son's soaked uniform and said nothing. A county official approached, carrying a red notice inside a plastic sleeve. The entire renovation area had been declared temporarily unsafe. No one could enter the terrace, boathouse, or service building until an independent structural and drainage review was complete. The permit itself would also be reviewed. The official was careful not to assign final blame. The original overflow route had been absent from the submitted renovation sheet. Investigators still needed to determine who had prepared that sheet, who had reviewed it, and whether the omission should have stopped approval. But the later warning was clear. Richard had received it. He had chosen to continue. By dawn, the rain weakened. Water remained inside 3 garages and beneath 2 homes, but every resident was accounted for. The preparation Devon and Naomi had organized had moved vehicles, fuel containers, medicine, and electrical equipment before the lower roof flooded. The neighborhood board chair arrived wearing borrowed rubber boots. He stared at the damaged terrace and apologized for calling Devon's warning unverified alarm. Devon did not accept the apology for the people whose homes had taken water. "Write down what happened," he said. "Include when Naomi sent the map and when the board decided to wait." The chair nodded. "We'll hold an emergency review. Not a meeting where everyone explains themselves. A review with records, drainage professionals, and residents from the lower road. Naomi added, and published the findings. The chair looked at her, then toward the flooded houses. Yes, he said, publish everything. Richard approached them after the official left. His polished certainty had disappeared with the terrace. I will pay for the damage, he said. That is responsibility, Devon replied. It is not repair. What else do you want from me? Cooperate with the investigation. Do not challenge the emergency removal of the wall. Do not pressure your contractor or your son to change what he say. Richard looked toward Camden. You assume the worst of me. No, Devon said. I am giving you the chance not to confirm it. Richard absorbed the words without answering. Then he nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was only the first decision he had made all night that did not require someone else to bear the risk. Later, Naomi drove Devon home because the medic had forbidden him from using his injured arm. Their dining table still held the maps, radios, batteries, and unused sandbags from the previous evening. Naomi placed the old drainage plan back inside its plastic sleeve. You trusted me with the channel, she said, but you still haven't answered my question. Devon lowered himself carefully into a chair. About the task unit, about why you believe silence protects people. He studied the scarred edge of the table. When your mother died, I had already spent years bringing difficult things home without speaking about them. I thought keeping them away from you was the same as keeping you safe. It wasn't. No, he looked at her. It kept me from noticing when you became old enough to carry truth without carrying all of its weight. Naomi sat across from him. I don't need every classified detail. I know. I need my father. Devon nodded slowly. Then I can start with why I left. Outside, a county survey crew entered the Vale property. One worker found the bent metal stake that had marked the buried spillway. The orange ribbon was torn and coated with mud, but still attached. He did not throw it away. He placed it in a clear evidence sleeve, recorded its coordinates, and installed a temporary inspection marker in the same ground. This time, no one ordered the warning buried. 10 weeks later, the torn orange ribbon rested beneath a clear evidence cover at the center of the county review table. It was no longer dirty enough to dismiss or small enough to ignore. The independent report filled 186 pages. It found that the emergency overflow channel had disappeared from the renovation drawing, submitted for approval. The county reviewer had failed to compare that drawing with older drainage records. But the report also confirmed something more direct. 11 days before construction ended, Richard Vale received a written warning identifying the spillway beneath his terrace. He had ordered the project to continue without a new drainage review. Richard sat across from the lower road residents. No attorney whispered beside him. He had brought one folder and no prepared statement. When the chair asked whether the contractor's warning had been misunderstood, Richard looked at Camden before answering. No, he said. I understood that the route might exist. I convinced myself that an approved permit mattered more than an unresolved condition. The room remained quiet. I wanted certainty before accepting the cost of stopping, he continued. The families below my property carried the cost of my waiting. It was not a request for forgiveness. No one applauded. Mrs. Alvarez asked when repairs to her foundation would be completed. Richard opened the folder and gave her the date. The Carters asked whether temporary housing expenses would be covered. He answered yes. The county revoked the renovation permit and ordered the terrace and retaining wall removed. Richard funded repairs to the affected homes, restoration of the overflow channel, and 5 years of independent drainage inspections. The county accepted responsibility as well. Historical water routes would now be digitally overlaid on every shoreline permit. Any conflict between old records and new construction plans would automatically require field inspection. Naomi had insisted on one additional condition. Residents had to be able to see those records before construction began. The county initially called the proposal technically difficult. Naomi brought a working public map to the next meeting. They stopped calling it difficult. Camden testified after his father. He described the message he found inside the service building and confirmed that no one had pressured him to surrender the tablet. When the chair asked whether he intended to return to the family development company, Camden glanced at Richard. "No," he said. "I'm not ready to help manage decisions. I'm still learning how to question." Richard lowered his eyes, but he did not challenge the answer. Their relationship had not returned to what it was before the storm. Camden had moved into an apartment above his martial arts studios. He met his father for breakfast every Sunday, but he no longer allowed money, obligation, or the Vale name to end an argument. Some mornings, they spoke for an hour. Others lasted 12 minutes. Both counted as showing up. Devon attended the hearing with his left arm still limited by surgery and physical therapy. When reporters asked about his military service, he gave them one sentence: "The people who prepared before the flood deserve more attention than the job I used to have." He directed them toward Naomi, Mrs. Alvarez, the firefighters, and the neighbors who had moved medicine and vehicles uphill before the road disappeared. That evening, Naomi drove him to the restored channel. The limestone terrace was gone. Native grasses covered the excavated ground, and a broad depression crossed the Vale property exactly where Aunt Louise's map said it should. A permanent steel mark stood beside it. Emergency overflow. Kip clear. Camden was there with a group of students from his studio. None wore uniforms or belts. They were planting erosion control shrubs under the supervision of the county restoration team. When he saw Devon, he wiped mud from his hands. "My students wanted to help." Devon looked toward the teenagers carrying mulch. "Did you tell them what happened?" "All of it. That could cost you their respect." Camden glanced at the open channel. "Then I was teaching the wrong kind of respect." He reached into his truck and removed the black belt he had worn during the storm. The fabric had dried stiff and uneven. "I almost threw this away," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because the belt didn't make the decision." "I did." He had stitched a narrow piece of orange fabric inside one end. It was not taken from the evidence marker. Naomi had given him a new strip. Camden tied the belt around his waist. "I'm keeping it as a reminder that control is not the same as power." Devon nodded. "That lesson will take longer than earning the belt." "I know." Richard stood farther down the channel, speaking with Mrs. Alvarez about the last repair to her garage. When their conversation ended, he approached Devon. "The restoration engineer says this ground can never be built on again. That is the idea." Richard watched water from a brief afternoon shower move through the grass toward the lake. "I spent years believing unused land was wasted land. And now? Now I know some ground is valuable because of what it is allowed to carry." Devon did not offer forgiveness. Richard did not ask for it. They stood beside each other long enough to watch the water pass safely between the homes. On the drive back, Naomi asked the question Devon had promised to answer. "Why did you leave the service?" Devon looked through the passenger window. "Because I became too good at returning from difficult places without returning to the people waiting for me." Naomi said nothing. "After my final deployment, your mother told me you had stopped asking when I would come home. You were 9. She thought you were adjusting." "I remember. You weren't adjusting. You were learning not to need an answer." Naomi tightened her hands around the steering wheel. "I submitted my retirement papers the next morning," he said. "But leaving the service was easier than leaving the silence. And Mom's death made it worse. Yes, I thought if I stayed useful, I wouldn't have to admit how lost I was." Naomi pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. "You don't have to tell me everything at once." "I know. But you do have to keep telling me." Devon nodded. "I can do that." Rain began tapping lightly against the windshield. For years, Devon had believed protection meant carrying danger alone. Camden had believed strength meant making another person yield. Richard had believed authority meant waiting until certainty protected him from the cost of acting. The flood exposed all three mistakes. What saved the neighborhood was not a hidden title, a powerful name, or one dramatic victory. It was a daughter who preserved an overlooked record, residents who prepared before they agreed, rescuers who trusted evidence, and people who finally stopped treating warnings as personal insults. Outside the car, rainwater reached the edge of the Brooks property and followed the reopened channel toward the lake. No wall redirected it, no order delayed it, and no one buried the marker showing where it needed to go. When certainty becomes an excuse to wait, the risk never disappears. It simply moves toward someone with less power to refuse it. If this story made you think about the difference between authority and responsibility, share your perspective below and subscribe to Hush Stories for more original dramas about the choices people make when silence is no longer safe.